Popularity. What is it made of? How does a person get to be popular with lots of people and have a few close friends, too? Let's watch and see what makes people like one person and not another.
Hey, Jerry, there's that new girl in our math class.
Oh, yes. Her name's Carolyn Ames. She's a swell kid.
Why? You know her?
Not very well. I wish I did. I don't know what it is, but there's something about her you like.
Well, she always looks nice to start with.
Yeah, especially when you compare her with some of the weird characters in this place.
Yoo-hoo!
Ginny thinks that she has the key to popularity, parking in cars with the boys at night. When Jerry brags about taking Ginny out, he learns that she dates all the boys, and he feels less important.
Well, poor Jerry, right? Unfortunately, this is the kind of stuff that a lot of people associate with the 1950s. Beyond it being the era of golly shucks, gee willikers, mister, and Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy, it's the era of conformity, where people feel enormous pressure to fit in so they can live in houses that are the exact same, so they can dress the exact same. And also this time period where we see the return of the cult of domesticity. We're going from the time of Rosie the Riveter in the 1940s to, unfortunately, what you just observed in that video. Precisely because of that, a lot of people tend to ignore the 1950s just because the world seems so boring and artificially squeaky clean. It's, in fact, when sort of pop culture returns to the 1950s, it's usually just to kind of make fun of it. Now, admittedly, pop culture makes fun of most historical time periods. Take a look, for example, at what Stranger Things has done with the 1980s, what Captain Marvel has done with the world of the 1990s. I mean, for the most part, we adopt the Whig view of history where we're going to return to the past, more or less to make fun of how silly and simple people seemed. But the 1950s is a target of particular scorn. And of course, we have to remember that this is the time period of the Red Scare, but also this is the time period where just culture seems so, again, squeaky clean that it's like smarmy, and it doesn't seem all that authentic. Economically, though, the world of the 1950s is one of the best time periods to be alive. By the end of World War II, U.S. per capita income was almost double that of Canada's or Norway's. By the way you get per capita income is you divide the amount of money produced by your country by the population, and you should get at least an idea of what the average person makes, and the United States kind of led the pack. And, you know, one of the things with per capita income, though, is that you're taking the average of not only what the poorest people make, but, you know, you're also averaging in people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, right? And so that's going to skew the numbers a little bit. But even if you look a little bit deeper, you find that this is a wealth that is not just concentrated in the upper class. It's not the Gilded Age. Roughly 75% of Americans identified as middle class and actually more or less led middle class lifestyles. And this is partially because of the GI Bill. Remember, the GI Bill provides government-supported education, college education, for returning veterans from World War II. And so they go get a college degree, and then they're able to basically earn and acquire employment that's better than the jobs that they had before the war. Now, that being said, there's still some inequality. In certain parts of the country, there's still very, very deep poverty. There's actually very deep poverty in what we would today call Appalachia, basically western North Carolina, northern Georgia, and in other rural parts of the United States. Because remember that a lot of the wartime economic boom is concentrated in the big cities that are industrial centers like Detroit. But the thing is that because a lot of that poverty is concentrated in isolated areas, people aren't really exposed to it very much. In fact, it takes a president who really comes from that era or area, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to really bring society's attention to it. But if you asked most people, or if you were able to kind of get a sense of what people thought, the general impression would be that the 1950s were a pretty good time to be alive if you're just looking at paychecks and balance sheets. It is also a time period where, interestingly, you see a pattern start to reverse itself. We've talked about the fact that there's this gradual shift from the countryside to the city ever since industrialization. Well, with the establishment of mass transit and highways and interstates during the 1950s and 60s, you start to see a shift away from that, where people start moving out into large suburbs. In other words, communities outside the cities that seem to offer kind of the same small town feel that you get in the countryside, but without the crowding and congestion that you see in the cities. And by the way, the 1950s is kind of known as the time period of suburbs, where returning war veterans would basically buy mass-produced houses in communities like Levittown. These are actually pictures from Levittown, including an aerial one, and you don't see a whole lot of, diversity. And in fact, you don't see a lot of ethnic diversity in these suburbs either, because, just spoiler, many of these suburbs had covenants where if you bought a house, you had to be a white person and you had to agree not to sell your land to non-white people. And you're probably like, well, that's just in the South, Mr. Dry. No, it definitely wasn't. It was something that you saw all throughout the country wherever you had suburbs. But that being said, you do see this shift away to a certain extent from cities, but cities are still kind of the focus of economic growth during this time period. Now, after a big war, there's almost always some kind of post-war recession, right? The economy really booms and expands during wartime to basically meet the needs of wartime production. And then as soon as the war ends, it takes a while for the economy to adjust and shift back to the production of things like consumer goods. So you're manufacturing things like luxury goods instead of cannons or tanks or whatever else. And in the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War, you do have a small slump after World War II, but it was pretty small. And in fact, what seems to happen is after that slump resolves itself, the economy continues to expand. It's almost more like a continuation of World War II. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Remember, like we talked about with some of Eisenhower's concerns, it's not as if defense spending exactly goes anywhere, that the United States still maintains a strong military presence, not only in the U.S., but throughout the rest of the world. And so it's not as if the United States totally shifts away from wartime production due to the Cold War. But there's also a few other things at work. Again, we have the effect of the GI Bill of Rights, in which it delays the unemployment that sometimes occurs whenever you have a large army of conscripts demobilizing. I mean, after World War II, there were over 16 million men and women in uniform. And so at the end of the war, that also creates a 16 million person employment problem. Well, the GI Bill of Rights kind of helps alleviate that. But the other thing that helps is the fact that the United States goes through about 4 years of war, and really during that time period, Americans just kind of save every penny they have. Partially that's because of lessons learned during the Great Depression, but it's also because of the fact that, industry is so focused on wartime production that nobody's really producing anything that people are interested in buying. So in other words, Americans have a ton of money stashed in the banks and nothing really to spend it on. And because life has been kind of put on hold because of the Second World War, it's not as if people had this need to kind of, go and get a house to accommodate a family or something. Because war has kind of, again, pushed the pause button on American family life. So after World War II ends, Americans can actually spend money again on themselves. And so that consumer spending stimulates the economy. And so you don't have quite that same economic slump. And in fact, gross domestic product, the total amount of wealth produced in a country in any given year, it basically grows by over 200% in just 15 years. And unemployment goes down to about 5%. And just in economic terms, I mean, any unemployment is bad, right? But for the most part, 5% unemployment is ideal. It's rare when we get to that point. So because of the emphasis on economic growth and conformity, a lot of people really don't like the 1950s. Again, it just seems boring to them. And my goal is not to make you guys love the 1950s by any stretch of the imagination, but I do want you guys to understand it. Again, for individuals who think that the 1950s seems artificial and its chrome finishings and all that, you got to remember that the people who built the squeaky clean 1950s were people like these. So you have to remember that the artificial, saccharine sweet 1950s was built by the people who had known nothing except for uncertainty. These were the people who grew up during the Great Depression and fought the Second World War. If you are that person, you've seen people lose their farms and jobs, and in World War II, you saw 300,000 to 400,000 people, in general, in the aggregate, lose their lives. This is a generation that's seen a lot. And so psychologically, when you go through life knowing nothing but instability, the goal is to do everything in your power to create a world that's as stable as possible. And so is the 1950s kind of is the squeaky clean image of the 50s authentic? Well, no, but I think that we can understand why the 1950s emphasizes, the values that it does. So the other thing that happens is that we also have to remember that life has been put on hold partially because of the Great Depression and because of the Second World War. And as millions of GIs return home, they want to basically sort of move on with their lives as quickly as possible. So what happens when millions of people return from war and realize that life is way too short? Well, they get married, buy a house, and have a bunch of babies. So by the way, I know this is the moment you've all been waiting for, but this is the origin story of the baby boomers. I know that in the vernacular, a boomer is any old fuddy-duddy person who is out of touch. But when we're talking about the baby boomers, we really mean the generation that's born from 1946 to 64. And there are over 75 million of them. And odds are these are probably your grandparents. This is a generation that is born to parents who have known nothing but uncertainty, and they're born into a world that tries to seem as certain and clean and wholesome as possible. And there's a relationship here. But here is, and this is actually kind of a big human psychology point rather than a big point about U.S. history. The thing is that when you have kids, if you do have kids, what people tend to do is they kind of go through a checklist of what made their childhood awesome and what made their childhood suck. And because we have that negative bias, we tend to focus on the things that sucked. And so as we figure out the things in our childhood that we hate, we try to ensure that our kids never have to go through those same experiences. This sucked for me, this caused me pain, so I don't want my kids to experience this pain. And, this is a natural and I think probably a very important, element to our nature. I'm not criticizing this, but the thing is is that your kids aren't going to experience the same pain and suffering that you did. They're going to experience pain and suffering, of their own. They're going to have their own unique problems, unless you really just don't make that list at all and you're completely unconcerned. And then maybe they will repeat some of your same frustrations. But for most people, they do try to figure out what they didn't like about their own childhood, and they try to sort of account for that. The problem is that for a lot of parents, they think, well, I had to work a lot when I was a kid. I have spared my child that pain of having to work as a kid. I am a great parent. Well, the thing is that odds are that kid's going to say, well, you know what? I really wanted to have my own money, and I don't know how to manage money because my parents never gave me an opportunity to go out and get a job. So that was what I missed out on. The thing is that your kids are not going to thank you for sparing them pain that only you experience. They're going to have their own problems. And so what we see is that the baby boomers actually resist this world. They become the hippies. They become, for a generation born to very conventional parents that try to, go out of their way to create a world that's stable, you have a generation that embraces chaos and instability and defiance of conformity. In general, we're... Again, every generation is different, and individual differences tend to be more important than generational differences, I would say. But there is something to that, and it's really sad, actually, when you think about it, because every generation has its own problems, but you do get the sense that the people returning from World War II are trying to ensure that their kids aren't going through the same traumas that they had to. And so they're doing everything they can to create a world that's safe and secure and wholesome. But the problem is that that's not what the kids need. The parents overcorrect, and the kids just resent them for it. So, in other words, being a parent, I guess, can't all be about you and your own pain. The challenge of being a good parent sometimes is to, sometimes not just see your kids through yourself, but to actually kind of objectively look at what your kids need based upon their own individual personalities. This has been brought to you by Mr. Dry's Terrible Parenting Advice. Throughout most of U.S. history, the term conservative doesn't really refer to a specific political ideology. Conservatism is really just a reaction to change, and it's skepticism towards change. And we have to remember that the fact that the 1950s is so conservative should make sense because, again, the 1930s and 40s taught us that change is scary, that change could destroy your economy, and it could maybe almost blow up the world. So you could kind of argue that in the 1950s, both parties were kind of conservative in a way. In other words, you don't see this urge for sweeping changes. I know that Harry Truman wanted to expand the New Deal program, and he expands it a little bit through raising the minimum wage, but it's not expanded too much. But at the same time, the New Deal isn't eliminated. There's this consensus between Republicans and Democrats that the welfare state should be maintained. Both Republicans and Democrats are generally pro-capitalist, and both are anti-communist. And so the big areas of, the big issues in American life and culture at that time, there's, generally a consensus between the major parties. And so with the emergence of the baby boomers, this puts enormous pressure on women, though.
If the image of a woman during World War II was Rosie the Riveter, the 1950s female ideal became Susie Homemaker. The same women who were often encouraged to work in the factory to support the war effort were now urged to demonstrate their patriotism by staying home.
If you look at the difference between the way the magazines portrayed women in the 40s and magazines portrayed women in the 50s, you can see a huge propaganda effort took place to convince women that their place was in the home, that they didn't want to wear overalls, that really you were much more fulfilled if you could cook a good dinner than if you could make a wing on an airplane.
You've no idea how much I've got to do. Remember, I haven't got your dream kitchen to make things easier.
This whole kitchen was designed for efficiency and convenience.
Experts like noted pediatrician and author Dr. Benjamin Spock and popular advice columnist Ann Landers encourage this homemaker image, advising women to put their children and husbands first, even at the expense of their own needs. Yet, even as many mothers prided themselves in their families, the number of women working outside the home rose steadily as they took jobs to help maintain their family's standard of living. Soon, both married and unmarried women were a significant part of the labor pool.
In the 1950s, 33% of the workforce is female.
Women who did not work outside the home often volunteered in their places of worship and in their charitable organizations. There, they learned the political and organizational skills that would become critical as they joined with working women to mastermind the women's movements of the 60s and 70s.
So we have this emphasis on women leaving the workplace and focusing on taking care of their husbands and usually raising kids. That's kind of the ideal, and this is the ideal that you see in many TV shows of the era. But we should also remember that the image sometimes conflicted with the reality. The fact is that women still comprise over a third of the workforce, and that number would only grow over time. And one of the other things to remind ourselves of is that a lot of families don't have the luxury for a single income, to be a single income household where only one member of the family works. So, unless you can afford to give up an entire year's worth of salary, what this should tell you is that the cult of domesticity is probably too expensive for a lot of people, particularly Americans that are sort of from working class or poorer backgrounds. It's the idea that women should stay home and focus on raising the kids was kind of the middle class dream and aspiration rather than something that you really see in the lower classes. So that being said, I think the video also mentioned the role that Dr. Benjamin Spock plays, that, with the birth of close to 75 million Americans during this time period, parenting becomes sort of a major focus because there are so darn many kids. And there's the argument that women are better adjusted to be parents, and so they should stay home and focus on raising kids. And also, by the way, as a kind of an unrelated note to the role of women, though, you do see the conformity and return to conservatism in other respects. In the 1920s, remember, the 1920s were sort of a wild and crazy time, especially in the big cities. And church attendance actually declines a little bit. So you have 40% church attendance in the 1920s, but by the 1960s, that number increases to to over 60%. So one of the things we also kind of see is that after major wars, you see an increase in the participation in organized religion. And sometimes when more people go to church, that makes churches themselves more politically powerful. So this is setting the stage for yet another time in American history in which American churches are going to play an outsized political role. That being said, though, it's hard to know if we can really start talking about it like it's a great awakening exactly. But the emergence of more evangelical sects of Christianity will play a major role in the emergence of conservatism. This is like ideological conservatism in the 1970s and the 1980s. Again, a lot of people find the 1950s boring because of the emphasis that's placed upon conformity. But if you look at what's going on behind the scenes, actually that conformity becomes very, very important. Think about the United States and how far it's come since the days of Jamestown. When we opened the course, we really discussed the American colonies as basically 3, maybe 4 different nations: New England, the sort of the Mid-Atlantic colonies. Then you have the South, but then you also have the Deep South. And as people started pushing westward, that diversity only increased. Going from, for example, Puritan New England to New York, not exactly a trip around the world, would lead you to discover people who spoke different languages, who practiced different religions. And by the way, this wasn't just an aberration. If you were an English settler on the coast of North Carolina, for instance, and you decided to head west, you would probably encounter at some point self-contained communities of German immigrants who, again, were self-contained so that they could more or less sort of stick with themselves and speak their own language. So we tend to lose sight, I think, just how diverse even European American society was in early American history. One of the reasons for this is that states and regions developed more or less independently. And to the extent that they did depend on somebody or something else, they tended to depend more on Great Britain than they did upon one another. Colonies like Massachusetts would probably have more regular contact with Great Britain than they would with, shall we say, Virginia. And even with the American Revolution, that didn't change things overnight. This is like I know it seems like we're taking, more than a few steps back, but one of the core reasons for all this is that states really didn't have to have regular commerce, regular communication with one another. And partially that's just because of the fact that you don't see great infrastructure between states. We mentioned during the aftermath of the American Revolution that it was actually, in some respects, much easier to transport cargo from one colony or eventually one state to Great Britain than it was to transport that same cargo overland to a neighboring state. And we've talked about the Federalist Party and some of the reasons that they had for wanting to encourage the development of national infrastructure like this. But when we've talked about infrastructure before, basically what we've been talking about are things like canals and turnpikes, like the Erie Canal. The big one, though, that we think about is the railroad, which, if you remember, was kind of a big deal in American history. But absent from this discussion so far has been the construction of the type of infrastructure that most of us think of, roads. We didn't really have them. And to the extent that we had roads, they weren't very good, and they didn't really go anywhere. And no, I'm not just talking about the 18th century or the 19th century. I'm talking about the 20th century. You don't really have national roads. And this is kind of a problem because the nation is increasingly dependent upon automotive transportation. Eisenhower decides to do something about this through passing the interstate highway system in 1956, the creation of federally constructed roads that span throughout the country. Now, this is kind of where Eisenhower's biography becomes important because Eisenhower was an Army officer. And even before the Second World War, actually, I think maybe right before the First World War, Eisenhower commands a unit of motorized infantry. In other words, soldiers that are supposed to be transported by trucks. And I think he was stationed on the West Coast, and he received orders to basically take this, motorized infantry and transport them to the other side of the country. And that journey took them not days, not weeks, but close to months. And this is just because of the fact that if you wanted to travel anywhere in the United States, well, for one, you kind of had to use a series of, state roads, and in some cases, just kind of like deer paths and trails to get from point A to point B. And Eisenhower is also influenced by his experiences in World War II. And he goes to Germany, sees the Autobahn, which is the national German highway system that was constructed shortly before the Second World War, and he's very, very impressed. Not only is he impressed because of the economic potential, the fact that you can actually transport more goods on these roads, but also the military potential is pretty important as well. Eisenhower is worried about the prospect of a sudden escalation in the Cold War. And remember that Eisenhower is not somebody who is pushing for defense spending, but he does believe that having a strong economy and strong infrastructure is of vital importance for national defense. So what Eisenhower is thinking of is that if the Cold War does turn hot, it would be very, very useful to have basically a national series of roads that the country could use to quickly mobilize the armed forces. So this is one of those examples of how everything is about the Cold War, even though it doesn't seem like it is. But you might be wondering, okay, what does this have to do with the country coming together? Well, think about what an interstate overpass looks like. Most people realize that whether they're in Oregon or Florida, whether they're in California or Maine, if you're traveling along an American interstate and pull off on any given off-ramp, you can probably find like a McDonald's, a Walmart. You can probably find, a number of the same types of businesses that sell the same goods and products. And when we were in the Gilded Age, we talked about how the material culture, what people buy and consume, is actually just a really important part of culture. We don't really think about this. We don't think that, a national identity is forged by, Starbucks lattes and things like that. But the fact is that if people are consuming a lot of the same goods and services, that has a way of bringing people together, of creating, things that people have in common. And the creation of the interstate highway system does that. The fact that suddenly you began to see, many of the same types of businesses sprout up allows for kind of the further creation of this common material culture. And by the way, my favorite, the Waffle House. But again, remember that while the nation's economy is, that's one of the things that's obviously considered, it's really more about national defense, if we're being honest. But by the 1950s, Americans aren't just buying the same goods. They're also beginning to look and talk the same. And to understand why that's the case, we have to talk about the television. So the television is actually not new technology in terms of the 1950s, but it takes a couple of decades for the technology to become sophisticated enough and cost-effective enough that Americans can reasonably afford it. And just like radio, the growth is astronomical. In 1946, there were only about 17,000 sets, TV sets, in the United States. Only about a decade later, there's close to 40 million sets in the United States. And if you think about the total American population, which is, just a little bit less than 200 million people, that means that, if you start doing the math and, thinking about things in terms of households, that means that by the mid-1950s, most American households have access to a TV that broadcasts in two colors, black and white, and has only three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. So what this kind of means, and this is hard for us to sort of think about today because we're spoiled for choice. Not only do we have regular network TV and cable TV and satellite TV, we also now have streaming services. And you might occasionally have those shows that a lot of people watch, whether that's WandaVision or The Mandalorian or Stranger Things or whatever. But that's more of the exception that proves the rule. We have so many choices that Americans aren't watching the same things. Well, more just by order of probability, or by virtue of probability, Americans are consuming the same media sources. If you have a TV and you watch TV, basically got a 33% chance of watching the same things as your neighbor or your friend. So the things that people would watch, obviously, it's not that different from today, to be honest. Obviously, the big draw is still sporting events, but you do have sitcoms from I Love Lucy to Leave It to Beaver. And the thing that a lot of these sitcoms have in common, though, is that almost always they portray an American family, a middle-class family, living in the suburbs with a wife that typically stays at home and manages the household, and a father who is a little bit more distant and is caught up in the rat race, basically trying to make ends meet. Popular TV shows are kind of like any other popular piece of media. They're a great way of taking the temperature to see what people are interested in and sort of see what's going on in the culture. So, for example, if you take the I Love Lucy show, we see some interesting trends that we associate with the 1950s. Remember, the 1950s are supposed to be sort of this squeaky clean time period. And we kind of see that on the I Love Lucy show. Lucille Ball and her on-screen as well as real-life husband, Ricky Ricardo, were portrayed as basically not sharing a bed. And of course, this got fans sort of scratching their heads eventually when a child was basically, or their child was sort of written into the show later on. So that being said, though, one of the reasons for this is that from really the 1920s until 1968, films and TV shows were self-censored based upon the fear of anything appearing overly sexualized. And we're not talking about, well, let's just say that sexualized in this case, includes things like, kisses that seem a little bit too intimate, or anything more than just sort of a peck. So this is actually in the motion picture industry, this is called the Hays Code, and is one of the reasons why culture seems a little bit too sanitized. Basically, in the 1920s, there were a series of scandals in Hollywood, and it appeared as if Congress was going to pass pretty strict regulations on the movie industry. And so what happens is that the major production studios during the time period, they sort of take the initiative and publish guidelines that are meant to restrict the types of content that could be seen in movies. And TV kind of follows suit and makes similar standards. So in 1968, interestingly, the same time period that we associate with the counterculture becoming a little bit more mainstream is when those guidelines are finally relaxed. Speaking of the counterculture, let's go ahead and set the foundation for that. So the counterculture is really something that we associate with the 1960s. And it's something that is specifically a response to the Vietnam War and people getting drafted to serve in the Vietnam War. And of course, it sort of has a domino effect. Once people start sort of protesting the draft, you see broader social protests that, connect to a lot of different movements, from civil rights to gender equality. You name it, there's probably a protest for it in the 1960s. But again, things like that don't just appear out of thin air. We have to go back and sort of look at the foundation for this movement, and the very fact that we have PSAs, like we've seen, on how to fit in, how to conform, suggests that the 1950s weren't a time period of perfect conformity. The canaries in the coal mine, or even just the leaders of big social movements at first, tend to be authors. And that certainly applies for the counterculture. So you have a series of authors in the 1940s, late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s who are responding to a lot of the same concerns. And the concern tends to be a focus on material benefit and material affluence at the expense of the soul. And this is not a new theme in American history. Arguably, we've seen this before with the Gilded Age and works like The Great Gatsby, to a certain extent, to the extent that history is circular and circuitous. This is kind of one of those points. But you see a lot of those same themes coming back. You can see this in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, where it follows the story of an individual or a protagonist by the name of Willie Loman. Just think about that, Willie Loman. That's not on the nose at all. Who is the salesman who, spoiler, dies. And Willie Loman is that, is kind of a really sad person who is trying to make it, who's trying to sort of climb up and make something of himself, and to achieve prosperity for himself and his kids. And he kind of falls short of the mark. And it's sort of an exploration into how meaningful that is, what makes for a meaningful life. And by the way, anytime I discuss literature, always take my summaries with a grain of salt, just in general. And fortunately or unfortunately, you don't have to know too much literature on the AP exam. These are, just ways of kind of gauging the culture, seeing what people are worried about, what people are responding to. And so The Death of a Salesman is just kind of an exploration in anxieties over the emphasis on conformity and the emphasis on climbing up the ladder at the expense of everything else. Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is something that also sort of explores many of these same themes. You've got a protagonist who is, like millions of Americans during the 1950s, a war veteran who's been traumatized by his experiences during the war. And to a certain extent, Tom Rath, the man in the gray flannel suit, tries to put those experiences as far behind him as possible by returning home and focusing on climbing up the ladder, getting a good job, getting a decent salary, and to a certain extent, his relationship with his wife, Betsy, is more focused on maintaining a household than it is on on maintaining a relationship based around love and affection. And what eventually happens is that, despite the success, despite the fact that Tom achieved sort of professional success, it later comes out that he had an affair while serving in Europe and actually had a child with a woman, and that the mother of his child is actually requesting child support. And basically there's this big epic clash between Tom and Betsy, and they just sort of realize that they're almost living separate lives. And they've been focusing on basically sort of climbing up the ladder rather than one another and their relationship. And so we, again, see this pushback away from, materialism in the 1950s. And not all of the major sort of groundbreaking works during this time period were actually novels. You have a lot of sociological works that become very important. David Riesman writes in The Lonely Crowd that, and this is certainly going to be a surprise to you guys who have paid attention to the last several minutes, that society values conformity over individuality. Something else that we've talked about that's where there's a lot of pressure to conform is in human sexuality. And if you see the sitcoms in the 1950s, they almost always depict middle-class nuclear families depicting spouses that are in heterosexual relationships. So one of the things that we have to explain is that in 1968, we have what's called the Stonewall Riots, which is kind of heralded or kind of considered the beginnings of the gay rights movement in the United States. And so the gay rights movement, just like the counterculture, doesn't just come out of thin air. And so in the 1940s and 1950s, you see a series of studies conducted by Alfred Kinsey,